Welcome to People, Places, and Things, a travel podcast that brings you captivating stories, fascinating people, and unforgettable destinations from all around the world. I'm your host, Ryan Lowe. Let's dive into this journey together. On today's episode, we have Michael Kaplan from Massachusetts. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Nice to have you here, man. Well, we're going to talk about your book, man. Very excited to talk about it. Tell us a little bit about your book. It's very cool, The Happy Wanderer, a Dyslexic global adventure. Tell me about it.
It was a lifetime in making, but basically I am dyslexic, which we'll talk about in a minute. And I struggled my way through school, so I eventually stumbled upon using travel as an alternative way to learn. And that made all the difference in the world to me. And so I had a lot of adventures in my travels, and that's what the book is about, and then what I learned from each of the adventures.
That's awesome, man. It's an incredible book. I've read it twice already, so you can tell I'm interested in travel, and you've traveled very extensively, and we're going to talk about that. But first, we're going to talk about you growing up and your childhood in Massachusetts. How was your upbringing?
I'm basically a middle-class child from Newton, Massachusetts. You'll hear it in my accent once in a while. I grew up in the suburbs. My father was a lawyer. My mother was taking care of the children. My father ended up and my mother divorcing, and my father remarried. So I have four brothers and sisters in my generation, and then two half-sisters, all growing up in the suburbs of Boston. And on the weekends, we would go skiing in New Hampshire and down to the ocean in the summers, and pretty much an average childhood.
Awesome, man. And chapter 1 of your book started when you were in college. So it was between your freshman and sophomore year. And your father, might I say, encouraged you to go and work as a merchant marine on an oil tanker in Houston, Texas. Talk about that for me.
Yeah, my father was a hardcore former Marine. He didn't like us having a cushy summer break, so he wanted each of us to get out there and experience the world. And in my case, he got a connection with a maritime union in Houston, Texas. So he called me in the day after my freshman year, and I was expecting to lounge around the house all summer. He says, well, what are you going to do this summer? And I said, nothing. And he said, yes, you are. You're going to be going off to sea. And that was the beginning of all of my adventures. Yeah,
so it was an incredible journey you had to Houston, and then getting there, it was a bit of an interesting welcome, right?
Yeah, so it was the longest flight I've ever been on. From Boston to Houston, and I arrived and I found my way to the Union Hall, and I figured I'd walk in and find out what ship I was on, and I walked across the Union Hall and all noise stopped, and everybody looked at me. I was 20 years younger than everybody else in the Union Hall, and they were all there waiting for their turn to get on a ship. So I walked up to the front desk and I said, hi, I'm Michael Kaplan, and I'm supposed to get on a ship, and the guy stopped me right there. He said, shut the fuck up. Go outside, walk around to the back of the building, and don't talk to anybody. So I did as I was told, and he said, what the hell's the matter with you? If anybody finds out that you are skipping ahead of the line, you're going to be in big trouble. You could get sliced, meaning cut by a knife. So that was my first indication that I'm no longer in Newton, Massachusetts. And so I had to wait in the Union Hall every day for like 5 days or a week so that the other sailors would see me and get to know my face in case they were put on the same ship as I was. And so in the evenings, I decided I have to stay in a hotel, and there aren't any hotels that are in my budget, so I got the cheapest one I could find, and that was in the bad part of Houston. And it was such a rickety old hotel. It was noisy. There were people fighting, having sex, all sorts of stuff. You could rent the room there by the hour, if you get my meaning. And I ended up putting the chair in the room against the door in case somebody tried to break in. And every night I'd hear the gangs out on the streets, and I'd hear once in a while a gunshot or somebody screaming. But that's how I spent the first 5 days waiting for my turn to get on the ship, in the Union Hall in the daytime and hanging out in that really terrible hotel at night.
Yeah, so I can imagine being at that age, getting exposed to that kind of debauchery. Mm. It must have been a culture shock for you, right?
Yeah, it was the first of many, I call it, what the fuck am I doing moments. And it took me out of my comfort zone. It took me out of middle-class America and gave me exposure to a whole different side of life I had never imagined. It was dangerous, but at the same time, it made me start thinking about, being safe and being aware of what's going on around me. And these are skills that I've had with me to this day.
Yeah, and I think that's important for everyone. Get out of your comfort zone and try new things. But, all right, so the ship arrives and you start working. You get on as an ordinary seaman. Yeah. Talk about that experience.
So the lowest level in the merchant marine is ordinary seaman. And over time, the most dangerous jobs have fallen to the ordinary seaman. The next level up is able-bodied seaman, and then you start up with the petty officers and the regular officers. But I didn't know any of this. I was in the ship channel, which is a very polluted, terrible place, waiting for my ship to come in. And old scow came in, and sure enough, it pulled up to our pier. And I remember walking up the gangway, not gangplank, gangway, and on the top tier, I slipped and I fell onto the deck. And all the sailors who have a way of putting one foot up on the railing and watching the world go by were laughing at me. And because I was a lot younger than everybody else, they said, "Hey, Junior!" And that became my name for the rest of my time on the ship. And a young man came over and he picked me up. And my first thought was, this is somebody I can go to the bars with in each port. And I said, "How's it going?" And he said, "How's it going, sir?" So the younger guys in their 20s were the officers, and the older guys were generally the able-bodied and ordinary seamen and doing the work. And so the young guy said, "Go up and see the old man," and used a bunch of terms I didn't know anything what he was talking about. But I knew the old man must be the captain, and I found his cabin. And he said, "Well, you're too young to be a seaman." And I said, "Well, I've been at sea all my life. I was 18 years old." And he gave me a lot more orders that I didn't understand. But I figured out that I was going to work at the dog watch, which was 12 to 4 at night and 12 to 4 in the middle of the afternoon. It is the least comfortable shift to work, and that's how I started on the ships.
Yeah, entry level like that, and being on an oil tanker, it must have been just an incredibly uncomfortable experience around people that you're not going to be friends with, and people that are very they're veteran sailors, and you're the exact opposite, right? So talk about Dutch a little bit. Yeah. So one guy took you under his wing named Dutch. Speak on him.
Yeah, so I didn't know what I was doing, and the work is dangerous, and I was scared. I slept with a knife under my pillow in case some guy tried to get friendly with me. I was way out of my element. And so one sailor took me aside, and his name was Dutch. Nobody goes by their real names. And his nickname was Dutch, and he says, "You don't know what the fuck you're doing." And I go, "I've been at sea all my life." And he called my bluff, and he said, "Now listen, just do what I do, stand where I stand, watch how I handle things." And so I was his friggin' shadow for the next 2 weeks as I learned literally the ropes of working on ships.
And talk about Dutch and kind of what happened to him leading up to his accident.
Mm-hmm. So, like I say, he became my only friend on the ship. He really did mentor me. And I was working one day, and I heard a big bang, and we all came running. And what happens is a rope parted. A rope is about 5 inches in diameter, and those are what hold you onto the pier. And a ship had gone down the channel, and that the space that a ship occupies, a volume, was so strong that it puts a lot of tension on the ropes. One of them parted under hundreds of pounds of square inch force, and it whipped through the decks, and it picked up Dutch, and it threw him against a bulkhead, a wall, and basically split him open. So I and everybody else came running over, and this was the first time I'd seen anything like this. And my first thought was, he looks like an egg broken open. There was body fluids coming out, his eyeball was coming out. It really was a terrible scene. And, of course, the Coast Guard came and took him away.
That's eye-opening, getting to see someone die right, essentially right in front of you and getting to see what happened to them. And it's a very eye-opening situation for someone at such a young age.
Yeah, and, like I say, I got an emotional attachment to the guy because he did take me under his wing. And I did go to his funeral. I was the only one there. And a lot of these sailors don't have families. And it just, first time in my life that something like this, somebody so close had passed away right in front of me. And it was a life-changing event. Very sad.
So your upbringing was a little different. So you go back to college, but I want to talk about Chapter 2 a little bit in the aspect of growing up as dyslexic and having that learning disability, not being able to read and write like the other kids in your age, and your parents not knowing what was going on, like many other parents at that age with kids struggling with dyslexia. Talk about that and talk about your challenges.
Yeah. So I started off the book not in chronological order. I wanted to share that oil tanker story so that it kind of, interests people about the rest of my stories. So the second chapter actually is the beginning of my life. And it's more or less normal childhood, except I couldn't keep up with the other students. And I would get these reports from my teachers. Michael appears to be very lazy. Michael is not applying himself. My parents felt the same way. And at that time, and this is the mid-'60s, nobody understood anything about dyslexia or learning disabilities. So their answer was that Michael has a speech impediment. And they used to give me tests to try to get me to speak better, but that was not the issue at all. So I grew up in the suburbs in Massachusetts without anybody really understanding that there was more to the story than Michael just being lazy. So as I started to learn to read or write, I was way behind the other students. And, we used to have Dick and Jane books. See Dick do this, see Jane do that. And I couldn't care what Dick and Jane were doing. I just felt like I can't keep up, and I kept falling farther and farther behind. And this is now in first and second grade, and I started really realizing that something was wrong, but nobody could put a finger on it.
And as a teenager, it just got worse, right? It just exacerbated.
Yeah, I talk to groups now about dyslexia, and what happens is you can get by, you can wing it when you're in primary school. But when you start into junior high, the reading level goes up, of course. You're reading much more material, much more challenging material. And it was there that I just kept falling behind. And it really impacts your self-confidence. You know something's wrong, but you can't identify what it is. And I just remember those years as being exceedingly frustrating. And again, not being able to identify what was wrong was just beyond frustrating.
I could see that, honestly, falling behind in school, and that coincides with the social aspect of in those times when you're going through puberty and you're at that age, that teenage age, you just want to fit in, right?
Yeah, I mean, they're awful years anyhow. And then when you add in a learning disability, and those they call it a disability in those days, now they call it a challenge. But I just kept falling farther behind. I wasn't a good athlete. I wasn't good at school, obviously. I wasn't good socially. And it just was a life of misery for me. And one thing that when I look back on that time, if somebody has a disability that you can see or witness, let's say hearing or sight or something with a limb, you can identify with that. But with me, I looked and spoke normally. And yet here was something that was prohibiting me from reading or write. I could not read or write through junior high school.
And that's tough because everything is, there's due dates for everything, and you start getting into those time crunches, and then it just gets worse and worse and worse, and you just keep falling further behind, right?
Absolutely. And we didn't have a solution. I remember the principal talking to my mother and saying, maybe we should think about a vocational education for Michael. He doesn't seem to be able to get along with his peers. They thought about holding me back another year. Just one thing after the next. And what eventually happened was my mother had me tested. There was enough evidence that something was wrong against my father's wishes. And it was a 3-day test. All I knew was I got out of school for 3 days. And it came back sure as hell, heavily dyslexic. There's no question about it. And that diagnosis absolutely changed my life. Finally, there was a reason why I was failing so much. It wasn't just laziness or stupidity or anything else that people had said to me. There was actually a physical problem there. And dyslexia basically is the connection between your eyes and your brains and how you interpret symbols and how you remember them. And I just remember a giant sense of relief that there was something actually there and it wasn't just something wrong with Michael.
Yeah, that must have been a very relieving moment, knowing that you had something in common with a lot of other people, because a lot of people do struggle with it, right?
Yeah. They say between 5 and 10% of all Americans are dyslexic, and it manifests itself in many different ways, so it affects other people differently, and it gets confused sometimes with ADHD and other learning disabilities, and they are sometimes interrelated. For me, the one I remember the most when I was starting to figure this all out was TION as a common ending of a word, and my eye would skip from one to another 3 sentences later, and I would go back and go, that made no sense at all, and I reread it again, and my eye would skip again, and I just finally started using my finger to trace the lines so that I would stay on the right line and try to figure out what was going on. But of course, it took much longer than any other student.
Yeah, but that's good you figured it out, and your mom was diligent about getting you tested, and it's important to realize these things early on in someone's life because it's crucial in those years.
Yeah, at one point they finally sent me away to a special school, largely for kids with learning disabilities in New Hampshire. It was a boarding school, and again another shock to the system and first time being away from home. But that school is called Proctor Academy. It's in Andover, New Hampshire. And that school changed my life. They had people who are specialists in kids with learning disabilities. They taught me a lot of tricks on how to manage it, and most of all, to be patient and not to be so hard on myself. And believe it or not, that was a big step in my development.
And in those years, we're already in Chapter 3, your teenage years, growing up, and talk about your father pulling you aside and giving you those words of wisdom.
Yeah. So when I was 14, my father took me for a walk, which is something he didn't do, with the arm over the shoulder. And I remember thinking, please don't talk about the birds and the bees. Please don't talk about the birds and the bees. And he goes, he couldn't say Michael. He's a tough guy. He goes, Michael, the guys you think are hot shits, meaning very cool, will be nothings. And the guys like you might be something someday. And at that age, I'm going, okay, Dad, thanks. I'm a nothing. And what he was trying to say is, if you keep working on yourself, if you keep learning and growing, that in the long run, you'll be a much better off person. And my father passed away recently, and I went to my reunions of both high school and college. And in both cases, I had several people around me asking me about my travels and my education and things I've done with my life. And a lot of them didn't remember me from high school and junior high and college, and I thought about my father's words. I kind of keep working on myself, keep trying to grow, keep trying to do interesting things, and it kind of showed for a moment there. I thought about my father and what he would have thought with people giving me the attention.
So you and your father had a difficult relationship. He was a great man, very successful man. But growing up with him was a little bit difficult with your situation.
Yeah, he didn't buy into dyslexia. He would say, it's all in your head. which technically is true, but not the meaning he meant to convey. And he just felt that if you work hard, he was a self-made man, he was a Marine in World War II, he was a lawyer, that if you just work on yourself, you can grow past anything. And for some reason I've never understood, he felt that my dyslexia reflected poorly on him personally, and that was hard for me. Obviously I was doing the best I could, but I just couldn't succeed. And he never really quite granted that there was a real physical manifestation of dyslexia.
He was a hard man, and it was a difficult situation and a dynamic between you two.
Yeah.
But eventually, it got a little bit better, I would say. But also, he did teach you how to ski and did take you on family vacations, and he showed you a lot of things in life, and you kind of take after him in some ways.
Yeah, I'm just realizing that now. He was a very dynamic guy. He never sat still for a minute. He had to have it his way. He was very strong-willed and a lot of fun to be around, very intense, very successful. And I'm not the first kid to grow up in the shadow of a very strong father figure. But he also taught me a lot of things important in life that I've used through my travels and my education and in my work and so forth. And I think, I remember taking a course, the best course of my life, and it was called Adolescent Psychology. And in the course, the teacher, he said, parents' job is to create stability and a framework for which kids to learn. A kid's job is to test boundaries. So therein lies the rub. In other words, kids keep testing the boundaries, which is what the parents are trying to create, and through the teenage years in particular, that really comes through with a lot of conflict.
And it's tough when you have such a strong connection to your family, and the way you grew up was you were all very close, right?
We're close in age. I have 4 brothers and sisters of my generation, 2 half-sisters. Very different people. We remain close, and we learned that from my father in particular. And they're still some of my best friends. He was just very much about taking risks, trying new things, seeing what your limits are. I give him a lot of credit because I'll give you a little example. When I was 16, he took us all parachute jumping. So here he is in the middle of a divorce with my mother, told her we were going skiing, and we didn't know it, but we went parachute jumping. And he had to watch each kid jump out of the plane, one after the next, while he went last, and hope that they all made it down okay. But it's a story and a memory that we treasure for always.
I think that personifies your father right there, his ability to have the courage and know-how and wherewithal, and that ability to be strong-willed and try new things and new adventures. That rubbed off on you. You try new things. You're always about getting out of your comfort zone, and I think you take that away from your father for sure. And I could see that in your life.
I think that's very insightful that you see that. It took me a long time to realize that. At the beginning of my adventures, like that oil tanker story, I basically did things to make him happy. But somewhere along the way, I realized that travel and adventure was making me happy, and to the point where I didn't care what other people thought. This is how I wanted to lead my life.
And that's a very important piece of advice for other people that want to please others. Just go on your own path, follow your passions within reason. Just go after what you want, and transitioning into chapter 4 for you. You go off to sea again. It's not conducive to your health. You get seasick. And it's a common theme in your life. You just keep going back to sea. Talk about going on that fishing boat in New Bedford. And again, it was your father encouraged you, quote unquote.
Yeah. So, when you have summer breaks in college, you have 2.5 months to do what you wish. And what I wish is what my father wished for me to wish. And in this case, it was a job on a scalloper. They fish for scallops, and I'd never been on them and never been a fisherman. And so we went out to sea. We weren't 5 miles off of shore when I started throwing up, and they called me a vomit fountain. I spent all 10 or 11 days on on each cruise, throwing up everything. That just consistently, they call it feeding the fishes, and that was basically my job throughout the whole time. And so you go out in a scalloper. A scalloper is a different type of fishing boat. They don't use net per se, and they don't use lines. They dredge the bottom of the ocean to try to scrape up beds of scallops, and then they dredge up the net full of scallops and everything else on the bottom of the ocean. And my job was to try to help the net settle onto the deck, and then shovel the scallops into buckets, and then the shuckers, or the other seamen, would cut the scallop out of the shell at a very fast pace. Meanwhile, the ship is going back and forth. They're not that big, and those heavy steel cages and nets are right over your head, swinging the opposite way, and it's a very, very dangerous situation. So everything was going on as best I could. I would throw up and get back to work, and throw up and get back to work, sleep as little as you could. And what happens it's called hot bunking, but when you're get out of your bunk to turn to go to work, somebody else gets in that bunk. So after a day or two of everybody sharing the same bunks, you've got oil and fish guts and everything on your bed, and they're all smoking in there. You couldn't see 4 feet in front of you through the cigarette smoke, and it was not a very healthy environment at all, and I was having a hard time, and I'd have to run out of there and throw up and get back in my bunk, and it was so rough at sea that I would bungee cord myself into my bunk so I didn't get thrown out of it, and a very tough life. And I can remember my hands shaking from lack of being able to keep any food down or whatever. And then we came into a nor'easter storm, and it's hard to explain, but at certain points, the entire, or two-thirds of the ship is underwater, and then because of the air in it pops back up. But meanwhile, if you're working, you get waves coming 30 feet above your head on top of you. One knocked me out and slid me across the decks to the scuppers, and the guys come and grab me and shake me off and get back to work. A very, very, very tough life.
Yeah, that storm must have been an eye-opening, like, hey, I'm not a fisherman. This is not for me. As soon as I get off this boat, I don't want to be anywhere near it ever again, right?
Even, these are now my college years. I was a very poor student, really struggling to stay in school. But nothing compares to, a life-changing existence like being on a fishing ship or an oil tanker. I was going, I don't care if I get out with the lowest GPA in the history of my major, which is actually what I ended up doing, but I'm going to stay in school because this working life on a ship is not for me.
So in college, you had a different dynamic. In high school, you weren't too social, but in college, you just bloomed and became a lot more social.
Yeah, it's funny. I went to a small New England college called St. Michael's College, and for the first time in my life, I started to blossom, if I can say it like that. I was finding ways to get past the dyslexia to a degree. It's always there. You never get cured from it. But I also came out of my shell personally. I started meeting women. I started joining groups of guys and having good friends that are my friends to this day. And a small New England college, it's really, for a kid that was lost like I was, is ideal because you can't slip through the cracks like you can in a bigger university. And that I could get more or less more personalized attention from the teachers and from tutors and so forth. And I did manage to graduate, but as I mentioned, and this is not bragging or anything I'm embarrassed about, I have the lowest GPA in the history of my major to this day, but I did graduate.
You did graduate. That's the whole point. So afterwards, you were looking for something, you wanted to start a career, but you wanted to travel. Your first trip was over to Europe?
Yes. So I graduated, and then it's one of those, what do you do with yourself now type of things. A lot of my peers got jobs in the family business or with connections in kind of entry-level corporate jobs. I didn't have those type of connections. And so somewhere along the way, I had a great idea. I'm going to bicycle through Europe. And I had visions of just biking along, meeting women, partying at night, and not much more than that. I got a free flight to Europe, but the caveat was in those days that they're not going to tell you where you're going to go. So I was going to either go to Rome or to London or to Vienna, Austria. I had no idea. And the flight that had the extra seat for me was to Rome, so that's where I landed. And I had my 10-speed bike with me and one crappy map. And I thought, well, this will be about 3 weeks of bicycling. And my 3 weeks of bicycling became 3.5 months because I didn't see the Alps on the map. And I ended up pushing my way up each mountain and then down again. It was much better going down than going up. And at one point, I even bicycled up to the Hungarian border. And remember, in those days, Hungary was part of the East Bloc. So I can vividly remember the border guards laughing at an independent young American with blonde hair bicycling up thinking he can go into the communist countries without a visa or even a passport or anything. And they just absolutely turned me away.
So what were some of the most crazy experiences on that cycling trip? You didn't know you didn't train for this at all? No. Nothing like that, right?
Yeah, I didn't know anything. I tried a bicycle ride around my neighborhood. I had my old 10-speed bike, and I put panniers on it, which everything I owned was in the panniers. I even, to save weight, I remember cutting the bottom half the handle of my toothbrush just to save that much space and weight, and everything was very important. And I started the first day out of Rome, and I just went north. And I got pushed off the road a number of times because the Italian drivers are absolutely crazy, and I kept having mishap after mishap. One of the life-changing events for me, and now I'm only 20 years old or so, was I was in Florence, Italy, and I was staying in a youth hostel and I met a couple Swedish girls and a couple German guys, and we went out to have a beer. And when you walk into an Italian bar with a couple nice-looking blonde women, they get a lot of attention, and it was a very uncomfortable scene, and the German guys kind of bailed out of there. And I was giving the girls their space because I didn't know them very well, but it also had the feeling that it could be an ugly scene. And so at 10 o'clock, the German guys came back and said, we have to get back to the youth hostel. They're going to close the doors. I told the women it's time to go back to the youth hostel. And, oh, we're fine. And in Swedish, I later learned Swedish, there's a word for naive women called being blue-eyed. And they were being absolutely blue-eyed to what I thought was a dangerous group of 5 Italian guys who didn't look very pleasant to me at all. So the Germans left, and I just didn't feel good about the women being there by themselves, but it wasn't my place to follow them either. So I was really in a tough situation, and I saw them go out the back way with the Italian guys, and I gave them a minute, and I decided to follow them. And like I say, I wasn't close with them. It was a really awkward situation. And I came out at the back of the bar, and there was nobody to be seen, and I started looking around. And what had happened was the guys had taken the Swedish girls into the local park, had separated them, and had said to them, okay, now we have the sex. And the girls were like, what? I buy you a drink all night. Now we have the sex. And one had ripped the shirt off the girl, and so this is when I came upon them. And now I don't know if I'm interrupting something good or something bad. And I go, hello, how are we doing? And she was like, Michael, Michael, Michael. And I got over there, and I gave her, the shirt was ripped, so I gave her my jacket, and I pretended I was going to hit the Italian guys. And then we went and got her friend out of there, and I got them back to I was scared to death that the Italian guys were going to come and beat me up, but I got them back to the youth hostel. And, I was not equipped to deal with this stuff. I was doing the best I could. The next morning, the girls had left with my jacket. I still remember that. And in retrospect, I learned that they're probably too embarrassed to return it to me. But, it was taking a little extra step. But I tell this story to my students these days because I want young men to understand some of the challenges that women face at that age, at any age. And it was a really life-changing moment for me to realize some of the stresses that women face.
Yeah, and for you, it was your introduction to international travel.
Yeah, I mean, bicycling through Europe, as an example, I would go into France, and the French, the people invented the word chauvinistic. They are not the most friendly, especially towards Americans. So they would give me the wrong directions on purpose, which was just awful for a little, 20-year-old kid on a bicycle. And I'd come back a few hours later and they would laugh at how I went the wrong way and all this. And but one thing I learned, even though I wasn't much of a bicyclist, you get stronger every day. You keep pushing yourself. You try to go a longer distance. You start to learn to read maps. You start to learn how to get along with people and how to buy things, and a lot of lessons that took me the rest of my life. And eventually, I made it up to Amsterdam, my final goal. And to this day, I have a certain amount of pride that somebody who didn't know what they were doing managed to bicycle basically all the way through Europe, and could have quit many times, but I pushed on. And that perseverance is something that I consider related to dyslexia. In dyslexia, you have to keep pushing on and keep trying, even if it's a little bit every day, and to eventually succeed and reach your goal.
And for you, at the time, academically, you weren't learning the same as kids. Talk about a new type of learning you discovered along the way.
Yeah, so with each new experience, I've recounted a few of them already, I would try to remember something that I wanted to take note of from this experience. What's my key learning, I call it. And I'd write it down or whatever. And I was just growing leaps and bounds. By travel, I was becoming a young man who had at least some self-confidence, a little physical strength, learning that I can manage other people from other cultures with a smile and sincerity, and ask them questions that kind of honored them, but also I really wanted to learn about. And through this process, I was changing and growing, if I could say it, a lot more than my friends who were doing the same mundane job in the corporate world. I was realizing that this is something that really met my needs as a person, to keep having adventures and to keep learning.
And that could be said about your willingness to open your mind and to the world and be out there and be curious. And that's what I want to impart on a lot of people, and that's very important. If you don't learn in that classroom setting, I would say to anyone that's young and hungry to travel, I would just say go after it. And that's what you did. And after your bicycle trip, which was very impressive, you kept wanting to discover more and more and more. So eventually that led you to ski. You're already a skier, yeah. So that led you to Switzerland, right?
Yeah, as I bicycled through, I came to Zermatt, Switzerland, which is where the Matterhorn is. It's a beautiful town. And I instantly fell in love with the place. And as I finished the bike trip, and with no other prospects in mind, I thought, well, maybe I'll go back there. So I went back to Zermatt, and I asked for jobs. And the first one I got was from a restaurant up on the mountain. I hiked up there, and I said, do you need any workers for the winter? And the first thing the Swiss owner said to me is, Americans can't ski. And, that's how he greeted me, actually. And I said, I can ski. And so he hired me. I came back in late November, as ski bums do. They found an apartment for me, and he had a troop of new workers. And in those days, you had to carry all your supplies up on a backpack up the tramway, and then you would ski down to the restaurant with those supplies that people were going to eat that day. So it was 6 a.m, so we had to wear a headlight, and he had his crew of about 8 or 9 workers, and all he said to us was, "You follow." And he took off with a Swiss Wedeling down a very icy trail that had rained the previous few days. I'm from New England, so I was perfectly comfortable on the ice, and I stayed right on his tails as I would have my father when he was teaching me to ski. And he, halfway down the mountain, he turned around to see his staff splayed out all over the piste, and me right on his tails, and he went, "Humph, okay, you can ski. You carry the eggs and the milk from now on." And that was my job, was to put the fragile stuff in my backpack. And we worked at this mountain restaurant, and we had a 9-hour work day. You could take 10 minutes off to either go to the bathroom or eat lunch. And other than that, you worked feverishly all 9 hours, 7 days a week, 30 or 31 days a month. And it was really a tough, tough life again.
So you were skiing to the ski in, ski out restaurant working, and that was your first experience in a ski resort town. And you're just getting overworked and burnt out. You're there to ski. You weren't there to work, right?
Yeah, and so I finally, his name was Hans. I said, Hans, can I have a day off? And he goes, what's the matter? You're sick. And I go, no, I want to ski. And he says, why do you come here? And I said, to ski, which was a wrong answer. He wanted me to say to work. So he fired me on the spot. And he wouldn't pay me my money for 2 weeks of work. So I did what most Americans would do is I went to the police and said, my boss won't pay me. And they said, okay, you come back at 5 o'clock tonight. And I came back with my best clothes, and there's the chief of police and Hans, my boss, and they're speaking Swiss German. They said hello, hello, and then back to and I had no idea what was going on. And eventually the chief of police said, let me see your working papers, and he took them. He said, let me see your passport. And I go, why? He goes, well, you're being deported. I go, no, I just want to earn the money I earned. And he says, nope, in Switzerland, if you make problems, you must leave. And I later found out that they were brothers-in-law. So that's the disadvantages of working in a small town. So I was heartbroken. I had told my girlfriends, and I had told my family and everybody, I've got a job in a Swiss ski town. This is going to be an amazing winter. And 16 days later, not only am I fired, but I'm being deported out of the country. So I had a tough night thinking what I want to do, and I decided, screw it, I'm not leaving. So I woke up the next day, packed one bag of dirty laundry, got on the train down to Italy where they had my passport, and they said, now where do you go? And I said, well, Italy, Austria, Germany, and they stamped out the visa and my passport, gave me my passport, and I went to get back on the train back to Switzerland, and the same police are in front of it. So I was going, okay, what do I do now? So I went into the men's room and I changed clothes, and then I climbed, there's tunnels under the tracks. So I climbed over to the back side of the train, went over the tracks, opened the back door, and hid in the water closet, and I snuck back into Zermatt, Switzerland. So I was an unemployed, fugitive ski bum. And I remember not walking on the streets because I didn't want the police to see me, and I eventually found a apartment or a place to stay. It was actually in my buddy's closet, so I literally was in the closet every night. And I finally found a job as a cook, and I remember that the police would come in looking for around the hotel once in a while, and we had a signal that when the police came in, I would go and hide in the ladies' room because the police officers were all men, and when the coast was clear, my workers would come and get me out, and I'd go back to cooking and doing whatever I had to do. And I spent the winter like that, skiing every day, working every night. And to be honest, I had the best winter of my life. And I remember sitting on a chairlift going, anybody else with more common sense would have left a long time ago. But I stayed at it. I persisted in my dream. And it was very rewarding to have a wonderful, wonderful winter.
That's awesome. And it speaks to your persistence and resilience. And that has led you through life, and you've kept that with you throughout life. You've stayed resilient and persistent in business and travel and every aspect. So you leave there, you get done with the season. Where to now? Where's the next step?
Yeah, so there's a society of travelers, and they work in different places, and they talk to each other, and you learn where the jobs are. So as I talked to other ski bums in Zermatt, they started telling me about places and that they were impressed with, or jobs that they were aware of. And it came to my attention that, well, I don't have to go back to the U.S. I can keep going and work my way around and have more adventures. And having had such a bad experience with education, I thought this could be something. So I left Zermatt, and I had heard that Turkey was interesting. And to get to Turkey, there was one train that goes from Berlin, Germany, all the way down into the communist world and eventually to Turkey. And I got a seat on that, and unfortunately, it was the time that the Germans had thrown out the Turkish and other foreign workers. So in my 42-hour train trip, instead of being 6 in our cabin, there were 14 of us and all their possessions in our cabin. So to get by, I went up on the luggage rack and bungee corded myself into a luggage rack, and I went like a mummy floating for 42 hours all the way eventually to first to Yugoslavia at the time, and then eventually into Turkey.
So how was Turkey back then? Like, what was it like? You've seen a lot of Turkey and a lot of remote places in Turkey. How did it differ, like, from your previous experiences in Zermatt and the rest of Europe?
Yeah, this was my first experience in what we call today the developing world. In those days, we called it the third world. I had never met Muslims. I didn't know anything about the religion or the culture, and I, tried my best to make my way through the country. I don't really love cities. I visit them, but I find that since I'm so interested in cultures that I try to get out of the cities and see how the real people are living. So I went for 3.5 months through Turkey, and at that time, the Midnight Express movie had just come out about an American who got basically tortured in prison for drug running. And so when I told my family I was in Turkey, they were scared to death for me, and there was no way to reach me. In those days, there was no cell phones or internet. To communicate, you would send a postcard or a letter, and hopefully 2 or 3 weeks later get a reply. You were really on your own. So I went through there, and the incident that I remember the most was I was asleep in a bus station. In those days, everybody had their own private bus. So they wouldn't go until their bus was full. So when you were buying a ticket, they go, oh, yes, our bus is almost full. You have a 5-minute wait. And that could be a 4-hour wait while you're waiting for the bus to fill up. So I was asleep in the train station waiting for the bus to get underway. And I felt something on my finger. And I looked up. It was a guy with very evil eyes and a big Turkish mustache. And he was using his clothing to shield him. And he had a knife on my finger. And he said he thought I was German, so he said "Wie viel," which is how much in German. And I said, what? And he said, how much? And basically he wanted my college ring, and pushing down pretty heavy on that knife. And it was trapped against the blade and against my chest, and it was not what you call fair bartering by any means. And I was scared to death, but at one moment, I breathed in, gave myself a little bit of slack, and put my hands under my armpits and got up and started yelling, hey, everybody, look at us. I make as much noise as I can. And then he laughed in my face, put his knife away, and disappeared into the crowd. The whole thing probably lasted less than a minute, but I remember every moment of it like it was 3 hours long. And my takeaway on that one was there was no good reason to me be going through the middle of Turkey with a big American gold college ring on. There's nobody to impress, so I learned that one almost the hard way with missing a digit. But ever since then, I try to blend in when I'm traveling, dress down a bit, and not be ostentatious or obvious if I can help it.
Yeah, and that speaks to today, wearing jewelry and flaunting what you have is just not acceptable when you're traveling through most of these countries. And in the developing world, you can run into situations like that, and that's a hard situation. And I could tell that, I could see that that's eye-opening for you, right?
Yeah, I talk to young people now. I go, there's no reason to have a big university jersey on or a baseball hat for American football or baseball team, or to basically say, here I am, look at me, I'm an American. There's nobody to impress. You're better to be understated, and it's safer to just not be so obvious or be so loud, which Americans do tend to be.
I agree with that. So leaving Turkey, talk about that. You had to leave in a different way.
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, I'd heard where jobs are from the people who are workers, and I had heard that in Israel there were plenty of work, and they would put you up in kibbutzes. But the problem at that time, I was in southern Turkey, is that Turkey and Greece had just had a war, and they had no diplomatic relations. So you can't go from one to the other. There's no border control. So I learned about a smuggler who comes to the shore every morning at 6 a.m. and picks up all sorts of people. Sometimes they're just visiting other family members on the Greek side, and sometimes they're actually running something they shouldn't be running. And he came, and I with the other kind of unsavory group, walked out into the ocean, got on his ship, and we took the ship over to a couple of different islands, and eventually I went to Rhodes, Greece, and hung out there and learned that there was what they call the hippie ferry going to Israel. So I had no money. I was completely out of money. I mean, less than $1 to my name. And I wanted to get on that ferry. So this is something I learned from my father, is I got in the middle of the crowd, far enough from the ticket takers, and there's hundreds of people trying to get on the ferry, and I basically wedged my way through the crowd, got past the ticket takers, and was a stowaway on the ferry. And the ferry was all full in those days with hippies playing guitar, smoking who knows what, doing who knows what. And for 3 days, nobody could afford a cabin, so you would sleep on the decks, and you kind of camped out your way across the Mediterranean and arriving in Israel. And when you arrive in Israel, they start making announcements, all cameras away, nobody take a picture of anything that could be considered a target. So no bridges, no major buildings. This was all about terrorism at that point. And so that was my introduction to Israel.
So you make it to Israel. For context, what year is this?
This is about 1983 or 4.
Okay. So you started working and living in a kibbutz, right?
Right.
Talk about your experience in the kibbutz.
So again, you talk to young people on the ship, and they say, we're going to go work in a kibbutz. And you go, once you get to Tel Aviv, and you find out where the offices are for a kibbutz. Kibbutz are run by the political parties, basically. And they offered me the kibbutz here, kibbutz there. And I'm Jewish but not religious, so I thought this would be a way to get back to my roots. And I asked for a kibbutz in the very north, right on the Lebanese border. And the only reason I chose that kibbutz is because the girl in front of me was cute, and that's one she chose. So I followed her. And I got there, and it's a little bit hard to explain, but it's the closest thing to communism you'll ever see. A kibbutz is like a farm and factory complex with X number of families that live there and an X number of volunteers that come in. And you work a few hours every day, basically for your room and board. They put you up in a dormitory, and they feed you. And each person does everything. So in other words, there's one cafeteria for all the families and the volunteers. Rather than everybody cooking at home, there's one laundry for everybody. Everybody shares in the spoils of, we made eyeglasses, we had a hotel, we had a farm for apples, we raised chickens. And I did all of these different jobs at different times, not really enjoying any of them, but again, another set of exposures.
So working and living in this, this essentially communist structure where everyone works together, and you do jobs and you provide and you get fed and you get accommodations. Talk about how long you were there, and talk about some of the dangers of being there in that time.
Yeah, it was very interesting. Eventually I became an apple picker, and what would happen is you would go out and tend to the apple trees and all that, and you'd go from like 4 in the morning till 10 in the morning, and then it became too hot rather. And so I would do my thing, and at nights I'd go to the restaurant, to the cafeteria, and we had days to lounge around and talk to each other. It was very interesting. And then we heard like rumors that there might be a war coming between Syria and Israel. And rumors grew, and in the nearby town, we could see tanks on flatbeds being brought up, and we could see off in the distance in Syria and in Lebanon puffs of dirt, which were their tanks driving around. And only then would we hear on the BBC, which was the only radio we had, possibility of hostilities on the Israeli-Lebanese border. And so they had a meeting of all the volunteers, and they said it could come to something. If you want to leave, you can. If you want to go to another kibbutz, you can. If you're going to stay here, we have to clean out the bomb shelters and prepare for the worst. And we were doing that, and then things seemed to calm down. And I was out in the apple orchards and doing my thing at about 6 or 7 in the morning, and you hear boom, and it was unbelievably loud. And then a second one, I went holy, and a second one came, and it knocked me off my feet. That's how close it was. And there's 2 types of shells. There's anti-personnel, which send out shrapnel and kill people, and there's concussion, which make a hole, and luckily this was a concussion. I remember seeing what looked like natural gas mirage, and that was a shock wave, and when it hit me, it knocked me right on my ass. My buddies came over, and I was like out of order, and they came and grabbed me, and we all started running back to the kibbutz. And it's funny, in retrospect, what you do when you're panicking, but I had visions of World War II where the shells would come and then the soldiers would follow right behind. So I took out of my pocket my passport and waved it while I was running like a son of a gun, hoping that the Syrians wouldn't shoot me because I was American. That's what happens when you panic. And it ends up that they were shelling from 22 miles away. There is no way they knew who I was or anything. And so we went down into the bomb shelters, and this one happened to be for Arab members who worked on the kibbutz, and they were all screaming and running around. And I stopped a girl because I knew she spoke English, and I said, "What are they saying? What's happening?" And she just screamed in my face and ran away. And my buddies and I said, "Screw this," and we went into the next bomb shelter, which was the Israelis who lived on the kibbutz, and they were calmly making sandwiches and playing checkers. And eventually, what we learned was that in the farm next to our kibbutz, the Israeli military had hidden ammunition and didn't tell the farmer. So he was burning his crop for a new planting, and when the fire came to the ammunition, boom, 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 and they went off, and the Syrians said, "Hey, they're shooting." The Israelis said, "Hey, they're shooting." And they had a shelling back and forth, and 3 people got killed that morning.
Wow, that's an incredible experience in a bad way, but also in the geopolitical, turmoil that was in that day. You got to see firsthand in the Middle East that you wouldn't see in the United States. So if you would have been in the United States, yeah, you were in more danger, but you made it through it. So talk about your breaking point. When were you leaving the kibbutz?
I had enough. Not the danger. It was people trying to indoctrinate me into Judaism. And I just realized that this is not how I wanted to live. I call it the neighborhood dog theory. They lived a pretty easy life. They didn't work very hard. They shared in the money from the kibbutz. But I realized that for me, I had more ambition and more drive. I wanted to do more with my life. And so it's easy when you're traveling, when you're heading towards something. And a lot of us travel because we're running away from something. But when you're heading for something you know there must be more, but you don't know what it is, that's the most difficult of all. And so I just felt there's got to be more out there for me. And I packed up my backpack and off I went. I traveled around Israel and did a lot of thinking, what do I want to do with my days? I'd been gone now for a few years, and I had run out of money. And for the first time, I flew back to the U.S. To see my family and friends. And my girlfriend had now gotten engaged to my best friend, so I had to go to that wedding. And what I remember most was I had had all these adventures and done all these things in a span of 3.5 years. And I had the pictures, and nobody looked at my pictures. They had just been doing their normal life. They go, "You've been gone how long?" It seems like just 2 months or 3 months. They were in their normal day-to-day world, in their own challenges, and they couldn't begin to understand or appreciate what I had been doing. And it kind of hurt my feelings that they wouldn't really ask me questions or look at pictures. But I came to understand that they had their own challenges, and me with a backpack going all over the world was not something they were really interested in. It was a hard lesson.
Yeah, and I can see that and relate to it. You get these social pressures from your parents, and everyone has these, to jump into the corporate world or jump into a career right away, right straight out of college. So it's a difficult thing to see one of your friends go out and experience the world like you haven't, and they just can't relate to that.
100%. And I thought, well, maybe I'm missing out. Maybe they know something I don't know. So I started getting jobs in restaurants and then some corporate jobs, and basically bouncing from job to job, from place to place, from relationship to relationship. I was really trying to say I got to grow up and live a normal life, but I was miserable. I did not fit in. And it's a little thing, but I remember it. I was a cubicle in a bank, and my calendar had pictures of different places in the world, and I would stare at that calendar and just dream about other places I wanted to go and see, and beyond the walls of my cubicle. So eventually I finally came to the determination that corporate life was not for Michael. I got to figure out what I want to do with myself, and it was a very stressful time, but eventually I decided to get back on the travel.
So you realized you wanted more, and you wanted to explore the world more. Even after that 3.5 years, it just wasn't enough. You weren't satiated. So it moved you back to working at ski resorts, right?
Yeah, I decided that it was time to earn some money, so I sold all my possessions and had enough money for airfare and went back to Zermatt, Switzerland to see what life held for me. And I got a series of jobs that every ski bum has done, working in hotels and restaurants and standing on top of the slopes with a camera going photo to try to take pictures of people, and a lot of odd jobs, anything I could do to earn some money. And the biggest job I had was that pictures on top of the mountain, and there were 3 companies doing it. It was like paparazzi almost, but I was hungry, and so I would meet the groups down in the station and say, I'm going to take a picture. I would kind of bribe the tour guides and say, if you let me take the picture, I'll give you some money. I would run to the hotels and sell them their pictures in their hotel rooms after they had a few drinks in them. And what was interesting about the photography was every single picture had to have the Matterhorn in it. That mountain is just like a huge pyramid looming over the town. It's supposedly the most photographed object in the world. And I would look at it every single day, and eventually I got the idea that I wanted to try to climb it. And I was not a climber, and I found a friend of mine who was a proper tour guide, climbing guide. They call him a Bergführer. And I asked him, would you take me up it? I gave him some money, and I prepared to climb the Matterhorn. To do that, you have to train, and I would go on long hikes, try to get used to the altitude, try to get used to the snow, and made an appointment to meet him up at the hut. It's called the Hornli Hut. It's up on the mountain. So you take a tram up much of the way, and you start hiking, and I met my friend Herman in the Hornli Hut, and basically we made plans to climb the Matterhorn the next day. And it was a fascinating existence. First of all, in the hut, there was about 40 other climbers and their guides there. You all sleep on a long bench. You start at 4 in the morning, so nobody got much sleep. And all I remember them was farting and belching because they give you a big carbohydrate dinner. And before we went to bed, I talked to Herman and about his life as a mountain guide, and he was actually on the rescue crew. And I said, really? He goes, yes, but there's no real rescuing. If you fall in these mountains, you're done for. And you wrap them up in a blanket, and they bring a helicopter over, and they helicopter the body away. And it really struck me in how serious this matter was, and I was about to do it in the morning, and there was no turning back. So in the morning, Herman woke me up, and we got dressed, and we put a little flashlight or headlight, I guess, on our head, and he roped us together very solidly, and we started our way up the Matterhorn. And the first thing you come to is a plaque in English. Our son, Stephen Miller, went up the Matterhorn without a guide and fell to his death. Please have a guide with you. And that was a pretty sobering thought. I kind of didn't know the difference between hiking and climbing. I didn't really think much about this, but very quickly I realized that climbing is a whole lot different, and Herman knew the route up, and I would stay right on his heels, and you have to put your feet where your hands were, and it's a hand-over-foot type of climb, very serious, and you'd look back first to be a couple hundred feet, and then it'd be 1,000 feet, and then 2,000 feet. We were going up a very, very steep face, and I noticed that Herman would knock down these little pyramids of rocks. And I asked him what was going on. He goes, people on their own make this pyramid of rocks so they can find the way back down. And he knocked them over. I go, so they can't find the way down? No, they can't, but we don't want them up here without a guide. So it was a way of keeping their union active, but also, pretty dangerous, because you couldn't see where the route was and where the loose shale was on the side of the mountain. So very dangerous things. And I noticed that if I kicked some rocks, they would just go bouncing their way down 1,000 feet. And I had to imagine that my body would do the same thing. So I stayed right wherever he put his foot. I put my hand, and I followed him up a meter away from him all the way up the Matterhorn. and you only stop once in a while. And at a certain point, the air is getting thin. You're in a rhythm. He doesn't want to stop because your body's warm. You try to drink a lot of water, and it was very tough. And at times, I didn't think I could make it. I really had hit my physical wall. And then eventually, after about 5, 6 hours, 7 hours of climbing, there was no more up. We had reached the top. I didn't expect it, but we were on the top, and it's a very jagged peak, as you can visualize the Matterhorn. In one direction is France, the other direction is Italy, and behind me is Switzerland. We stopped, took a couple pictures. I remember a helicopter of tourists coming around and buzzing the peak, and I jokingly motioned for them to come and take me away. And then you start right back down again, so your body doesn't have a time to cool down. And what I never knew is that going down was much harder than going up. And because you can't see where you're going to place your feet. And a few times I would start slipping, and I'd go, hey, 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 hey. And he would throw the rope that connected us around a rock cropping, and that would stop my momentum from sliding off the Matterhorn. And this was very serious stuff, and I really had no idea what I was getting myself into and nothing to do. You had to go down. And at one point, he could see that I was not all there, physically or mentally. And he started yelling at me to try to get that I was doing a terrible job and everything. He was trying to get my adrenaline going. So because I was now risking his life as well as mine as I went down the Matterhorn. Very scary. A couple times he belayed me, which he would put the rope over a rock and kind of let me turn backwards to the mountain and skip, and he would lower me down 30 feet and then come down and join me. So we were doing our best to get down off the mountain. Very tough. I could tell he was angry, and I understood why. It was very dangerous. And but I eventually made it down, and I remember, this is the most dangerous thing I've ever done, a day that changed my life. I learned about my physical and mental walls. But I went to the post office, and I asked them to call to my mother. That's the only way you could make a phone call. And I'd get in the booth, and I told her, Mom, I climbed the Matterhorn. And she goes, oh, that's nice. Her frame of reference was the Matterhorn at Disneyland, and no big deal. And she goes, so how's the weather over there? And that was the story I had to share with her. That was all I could, she couldn't identify with what I was doing. And I had even left a little will under my pillow of my apartment in case I didn't make it back. And it was probably 28 hours of my life that absolutely changed my life and learned a lot about myself. And the next year, as an epilogue, Herman took 2 Americans up the same route that I went, and one of the Americans slipped, and he took the other 2 because they're attached by rope with him, and they all fell to their deaths. So I say a little prayer when I think of Herman and the Matterhorn and how it changed my life.
That's an incredible physical achievement and some that people can only dream of. And, it must have been kind of deflating when you told your mom over the phone and she's just like, hey, how's the weather?
Yeah.
And the same with like friends and everything. They can't relate and be in that experience with you. So it's one thing is you just got to take it and be happy that you did it. And I know that was something that you dreamed of. And when you accomplished it, I bet you were so fulfilled.
Yeah, again, way out of my experiential zone, nothing I'd ever thought of doing before. I didn't do a good job, like I didn't do a good job bicycling through Europe, or I didn't do a good job in this thing or that thing, but I did it. And I did it on willpower and perseverance and discipline, and it's lessons that I've taken with me for the rest of my days. So I would eventually just spend the winters in Zermatt and work all sorts of different jobs and talk to the local ski bums. We became a very close community, learn where the other jobs are, learn places to see and visit, and that became my home base for the next 5 years. I would work there in the winter, save my money, and go travel for 8 months, either picking grapes or working in beach resorts or whatever I could do. And eventually there was a travel company called Wagon Wheel, and they had a thing for people under 26 where as long as you went east, you could get on their flights and on a standby basis, and as long as you went east, it didn't matter how many flights you took. So I decided to do a zigzag route around the world going east. And there may only be a few degrees off from the previous city or place I was at, but I zigzagged my way around the world. And one of the most interesting things I did was actually go into China, which had just opened up to Westerners a year before.
So talk about China. You were there for around 3-4 months, and one of the first Westerners that got to experience that in the 80s. Talk about how much that they needed to develop and how raw it was back then.
Yeah, it had just gotten done with hardcore communism. They were starting to open up to the world. It was at that time considered very exotic to be able to see China. It was nobody knew what it was like. So they all wore what was called Mao suits, which were either green or blue suits that made everybody look the same, men and women, with the same type of hat. And they were so poor. A wealthy family had one bike that they would all ride on together. There were no cars. There was very little other infrastructure. People lived on next to nothing. I could see people who were either dead or dying on the side of the road. It was a very poor, and the thing that hit me the most were the masses of people. As far as the eye could see, on any kind of road or any open space, just masses and masses of people, all dressed the same, going about their day. And I had blonde curly hair. I really did, 6 foot tall. I really did stick out. But I made my way around China, and the first thing I wanted to do was take a flight to go to another part of China. And there's only one office. It's all communist run. And we waited about 5 hours to go up and get on a flight. And you asked to go to a certain place, and Chinese go Mayo, which means no, but wait a minute. And it basically means they want a bribe or they want some kickback to be able to get you on the flight. I didn't know that, so they would come back and say, no, that's not possible. In Chinese, I didn't understand everything. And I'd say, how about a day before, a day after, up to 5 days in each direction. And then I said, well, how about to this city? Same thing. Hours to try to buy an airline ticket. And eventually I was able to get one, but I saw what they're doing. In the back room, they had a sheet of paper that had the name of the flight and the date, and then little numbers on the side. And when they sold a ticket, they'd rip off that number. So when all the numbers were ripped off, it must mean that the flight is full for that day. No computers, no telephones, no nothing. And I eventually took that flight to what's called Guilin, a place in southern China. And the plane was made up of 3 parts of former Soviet airlines, and they didn't bother to repaint it. So I was on what looked like a patchwork plane going to southern China. It was very scary. It barely made it over the mountains. And halfway through the flight, the co-pilot came back and gave us each a little gift for flying with his airline.
That's another world, man. And I'm just so interested in that travel in particular because it's so difficult, but especially back in those days. You didn't have your phone. You don't have anything. Talk about your difficulties with the language barrier alone, and then some of the more weird things you ate in the country, and some of the more interesting things that you enjoyed about it.
It's so hard. I was getting to be a good traveler. I was getting to be good at pantomiming because I'd used to travel around Europe now, and little tricks and smiles. But all those little human interactions were out the window in China. There was really no smiling back and forth, certainly no language. They weren't set up for tourism. They didn't have public bathrooms. You go into a hotel, which you would think would be tourist-oriented, and they wouldn't have a room unless you bribed them. It was a very hard time. I lost a lot of weight. But eventually I hooked up with a Swedish guy and a Swiss guy, and there was a little bit of safety in numbers and trying to figure things out together. And we went to what's called a People's Restaurant, which is on the side of the road. A People's Restaurant, it didn't even have really running water. When you ordered something, you would go get your chopsticks and your plate, which were not cleaned. And so you'd run the chopsticks under your armpit and hope your T-shirt cleans them off a little bit, same with your plate. And we asked for beef with rice and vegetables. The rice was rice. The vegetables was, we believe, seaweed. We couldn't identify it. And the beef had little bones and cartilage in it. So the the Swiss guy said it must be rabbit, and the Swedish guy, he didn't speak English very well, and he was thinking cat or dog, and because you would see people with a burlap bag going home with the dinner with a meow or a bark coming out of the bag, and I didn't know what it was, so we went over to where they were cooking, and we were astonished to find dead rat, dead rat, dead rat, dead rat. So our beef was actually cooked rat.
That's insane, man. And back then, that's what they ate to survive, and I totally get it, and that's just what they had to do. But being a traveler and being one of the first Westerners in there, you just got what they got. You ate what they ate.
Yeah, we did the best I can. I lost 17 pounds, and I was only 150 some odd pounds to start with. So a lot of my body weight traveling around China. It was interesting. It was at parts beautiful, very hard country to travel in for the reasons I've illustrated already. And eventually I made my way down to Hong Kong, which was with England at the time and with the West. And I basically camped out for 3 weeks in Burger King and KFC, just eating foods that I was familiar with and gaining weight again.
Well, you might have put that weight back on and then some, right?
Yeah. You do the best you can. You're young, you try new things and have adventures as you go. And, I went around the world like that, doing every odd job there is to do. And eventually, I was reaching towards the end of my 20s going, I can't just keep traveling. I can't just keep skiing and chasing women and skiing bumps. And I have to figure out what's going to happen with me and what I want to do. I was feeling the pressure of the real world and trying to, find myself. And it was a very difficult time in my life. So I would take a job, more or less the corporate world, and within half a year, I would go, this is not for me, and I would get on the road again, and I spent my 20s and early 30s this way, really having a hard time.
So you bounced around and you got back into ski resorts as well in the U.S., at Loon Mountain, and then you came out west to the Rockies. Isn't that right?
Yeah, as well as I worked in Austria, in France, in Sweden, and again, you learn where the jobs are, go there, try to get a cheap apartment, take a few jobs, ski your ass off, chase women at night, go out drinking with your friends. I was used to that world. I was becoming very good at that world, but also had the nagging feeling like there's got to be more to life. And I see it even where we live now in Park City, Utah. What's cool when you're 23 isn't so cool when you're 29. And you start to see, let's say, an older ski bum working a menial job, and you got to begin to wonder, is that my future? And this is a time where I really had to do some serious thinking about what I want to do with my life. And so I went back to law school in the U.S. They took me in, and I was miserable. All my family lawyers, I thought that was my future, and I just hated every single day fighting against the system. It really did not appeal to me, and yet my father was a famous lawyer, and I really didn't know what to do. So I saw a poster on the wall, and it said law school in the Soviet Union. And I thought, well, this will be the best of all worlds. I get to go to the Soviet Union and see that, which was really off limits in the middle of the Cold War, and yet I could also study law. So I joined that and went over there, and while I was there, I found out I flunked out of law school. So here I am in the Soviet Union going to school and studying law, and their way of teaching, because it was communist, there was no need to entertain the students. They all had their positions because they were Communist Party members. So their way of teaching was to read to us for 5 hours a day, and we would just sit there in the classroom and listen to them read. Not the most stimulating class.
And you went back to law school, and it might have been pressure from your father and pressure from the outside world telling you need to get in this corporate world and go back to school. But law school, that is totally not conducive to your dyslexia, and absolute opposite. Like it's something you have to read and write on a daily basis at an insane level. So you go into the Soviet Union and there being a language barrier. And how was that, them reading to you in broken English, and how was learning over there different from learning in the U.S.? I can imagine the difficulties.
Yeah, in law school in the U.S., they use case studies, which are at least a story, and then you're meant to apply the law to that case. In the Soviet Union, they would just read theory to you based on socialism, or at least their understanding of it, and communism, and monotone. Moreover, the study says that whatever, and they would just monotone read to you for 5 hours. You're supposed to be able to understand what's going on. I didn't have a clue. Shaken up that I'd failed out of law school anyhow in the U.S. is nothing to go back to. And one of the ones that sticks in my mind is we met up with a bunch of Communist Party students our age, and they're very protective over there. They don't let you out. You're with your tour guide. You have to stay in your hotel. You have to stay in your classroom. You have to stay on your bus. They don't want us interacting with the local people. This was communism at its worst. And so we were with a party, a get-together of young students, and this was our first chance to really talk to young Russians our age, and they wanted to talk about chess or famous Russian scholars or something. Absolutely no chance of talking about politics or democracy or communism or anything like that. And it was very interesting how they would deflect the conversations. And we would try to, we were used to our American propaganda, which was we have bigger houses and more cars and a better quality of life. And I always remember what they came back to me with is, you have to understand what took your culture 500 years to the Industrial Revolution and to develop. We've done 80 years. We were serfs just 80 years ago. And so, indeed, they were now on par, superpower with the U.S., and they had done what we took 500 years to develop. They did in 80 years, but at a terrible cost to their freedoms and their society.
But at the same time, it's Western programming versus Eastern programming, and a lot of people seeing each other as enemies. You're my enemy. You're the opposite from me. I don't want to learn that much about you. I want to talk about our country and the way we've succeeded, and we do it differently than you, but we're still successful. It's just you're programmed, and at some point, there is the brainwashing, it's the education system, and that is still relevant today, I believe.
I agree with you 100%. One of my takeaways at that age was I was expecting to see the evil empire, as Ronald Reagan described it. And these were people just like me. They had the same challenges, same problems. Did they have as nice eyeglasses or whatever as I did? No. But it was very important, and I think it's instructive, to see who you are told is your enemy, to see them in real life. And it humanizes them. And it just had a big effect on me for the rest of my days, and there's no question. I remember a cute scene. We went from the Soviet Union in Moscow and Leningrad over to Warsaw, Poland, which was a socialist country at the time. And I had more freedoms in Poland, so I broke away from the group, and I went even just shopping without our tenders. Our tenders were our guides, but they really worked for the KGB. And I went into a shoe store, and I was expecting from our propaganda to see no products on the shelves, and the shelves were full. So I was kind of unsure what to do, and I started looking at the shoes. They weren't great design or anything, but eventually I noticed there only left shoes. And presumably somewhere else in the country were only right shoe stores. And the reason being is they would tell in communism for the factory to make X number of shoes and not care about lefts or rights or the design or the quality or whatever. That as long as the factory manager put out the right number of shoes, he had his job secure.
That is absolutely insane, and for me it makes no sense and doesn't make sense. But talk about the difference between Poland and Russia in that time, even though they were under a communist umbrella.
Yeah, so at the end of World War II, Soviets had suffered terribly with Stalin as a leader, so he made all the border countries to their west communist, and he made sure that the communists won the elections, and so there was a band of communist countries from the Baltic states in the north all the way down to Yugoslavia in the south of client states. And that became 40 years of the Cold War, where the Soviets would not allow any real democracy in those countries. But Poland was markedly more free than the Soviet Union had been. And one of the interesting things is when you would go to the border between Poland and the Soviet Union, you'd have to wait there for 5 hours because they would lift up the train and put a new set of wheels underneath it with different tracks. Stalin had made it so that the tracks in Poland were different than the tracks in the Soviet Union, so if the Germans or anybody else were attacking them, they couldn't use the train to get all the way to the Soviet Union. So every train had to wait 5 hours while they put new carriages underneath them. Little thing, but that type of thing is what permeated life. All of my time there, people would look at me. They obviously would see that I was Western. If they had courage, they would come and talk to me. But very seldom, they more looked at me with suspicion. They didn't want to get in trouble for talking with a Westerner. But it was fascinating. I count myself very lucky to have seen the former East Bloc countries and Russia during the Cold War period.
Yeah, not only did you get to see it, you did have tenders, but you got to see it in your way as well, and you got to experience learning there. So that's just a different dynamic than just traveling there in that time, which was almost impossible anyway.
Yeah. And while I was there, I mentioned I got the telegram that said I'd flunked out of law school, so there was no real reason to me to go back to the U.S. to go back to school. And so I decided, what am I going to do? I can't stay in the communist countries. So I decided to travel again, and I went up to Scandinavia, had a bunch of adventures up there. It was interesting, and I had a weak spot for tall blondes, so I was in a little kind of a heaven in Scandinavia. And I went to see different countries and work different jobs. And I went to see an old girlfriend in a little island called Gotland off the coast of Sweden. And I wanted to see if this could be more of a relationship. I wanted to know for sure because it might have been the first girl I had ever fallen in love with. She was really something special for me. And she met me off the ferry, and within a moment, I knew there was no more magic or whatever. And so I stayed with her family a couple days and decided to keep traveling on this island. I loved it. It was called Gotland, Visby Gotland. It's a medieval island, very beautiful. And I again fell into my role of trying to look for jobs and started asking in restaurants. And I wanted to have a beer to kind of think about life. And I had 100 krona. And I thought 100 must be a lot. And after one beer, I had 40 krona. And I go, oh, this is not a lot at all. And so I went to every restaurant and bar trying to find a job. And eventually I got a job as a pizza baker. And the interview owner of the pizza restaurant said, do you know how to make pizza? And when you're hungry, you have a tendency to exaggerate a little bit. And I said, yeah, I'm a great pizza baker, having never made one in my life. And he hired me. And I could not get that thing round. It kept coming out like an American football or like a heart. And the poor waitresses would try to serve these misguided pizzas, and she would say, well, the chef's American, so he made it look like a football. The chef's in love, so he made it look like a heart. And eventually I learned to actually get the pizza round and to be a pretty good pizza maker.
So, yeah, it's just learning new things and taking on new challenges. And, I mean, it is a common theme in your life. But for the main reason why you were up there was for a woman named Marie, which I remember. Go back a little bit and talk about where you met her and how that love sparked, and tell me about her a little bit.
Yeah, I had taken a course in Sweden and saw her at the student lounge. And, it's a little bit cliche, but when she walked in the room, I couldn't hear the music anymore. She had just took my breath away, and I had to figure out some way to meet her. She was just so beautiful and so kind looking. And eventually I pulled the old, excuse me, do you speak English line, which did work with women because especially in Scandinavia, they all speak English and they all like to practice. Met her. We had a romance. She had come to visit me in Switzerland when I was doing my ski bum days. And we had a very special romance, but eventually whatever happened, and it unblossomed. And I always wondered about her, so this is my way to kind of see her again and see if I still have the same feelings, if she still had the same feelings. And it was clear we didn't, but I count myself lucky. A lot of people fall in love with somebody and something happens and they always wonder. At least I had closure that this was not going to be something in my life. And I count myself lucky to see her, and she wasn't as beautiful as I remember, or as nice as I remember, as kind, as sexy. It wasn't the same. So it was a hard lesson to learn, but I count myself lucky that I was able to at least learn that it was not something to hang on to.
But you found yourself in this seasonal island again, right? It's a seasonal island, and you're working and partying and meeting new people, and you really have an affinity for Swedish culture and Scandinavian culture in general, right?
Yeah, I eventually learned Swedish. I like the mentality. When you have a friend who's a Scandinavian or a Swede, they're your friend for life, and that's really true, but it's hard to make friends from the outset. But I was learning a lot. If I'm being honest, I was chasing women like crazy. I was working every odd job there was to do. And it was a fun and interesting summer learning about that culture. And, I just kind of really fell in love with that culture. You're absolutely right. And so then it was time for me to move on. The summer was over. And where do I go from here? And I had heard about cheap ferries from Scandinavia to Poland, and I thought I'd like to learn about the East Bloc countries.
So moving on to the East Bloc from Scandinavia, a stark contrast in culture and amenities. So talk about when you arrived in Poland, you already had a little bit of a introduction there before, just a little bit, but then moving on from Poland into the other Eastern Bloc countries. Talk about your start there in Poland, and then what it was like going through those Eastern Bloc countries.
Sure. I remember the ferry came into Gdansk, Poland, and that was the home of the Solidarity movement. This is now the late 80s, when the East Europeans, especially the Polish, were rebelling against their Soviet taskmasters. And so I came out of the ship pier and into the town, and all of a sudden, thousands of people were walking by going, Solidarność, Solidarność, which was a protest for Solidarity, a trade union. So if you think about it, the communist ideology was that it's a place for farmers and trade unionists, the workers and the farmers party. And here it was, the trade unions were protesting for rights that they just didn't have. And I had nothing better to do. I had my backpack on, and so I joined the crowd. I put my fingers in a V, and I followed along, going, Solidarność, Solidarność. And we walked for a couple of miles to a famous church, and I noticed something stirring in the crowd, and they were making way for Lech Walesa in a car. He was coming to speak to this protest. Now, those of you that don't know Lech Walesa, he was an electrician in the union, started Solidarity movement, and became the figurehead for it. And he was speaking. I saw him. I was right next to him in the middle of a very important part of history. That moment in time was the beginning of the end of communism in Eastern Europe. So I was there, and at one point, some young guys came to me. They could see by my sneakers and by my belt that I wasn't Polish, and they looked around and they slipped me a newspaper. It was the Solidarity, I guess, propaganda newspaper, and I was able to smuggle that out of the country, and I couldn't read it, but eventually I had people translate it, and it was how they were organizing themselves. And, in the middle of the crowd was also their version of the KGB, so everybody had to be understated, but also there was power in people, and they were able to protest, and like I say, it eventually became the downfall of all the East European communist regimes.
And this is the later half of the 80s.
Right.
So you're moving throughout the Eastern Bloc. So you being a part of history, being a part of that whole moment in time must have been looking back, hindsight, you're like, wow, that was it. But when you're in the moment, you don't think about it as being history being made, an iconic time and an important part of their history.
Absolutely. You're on survival mode. You're on learning mode. Nobody, even them, knew what was coming soon. You just don't know what the future holds. I was just all interested in learning about the cultures and seeing how people lived. So I would take a train and go to the next country, and I would see sites in each East European country. In those days, very few Westerners and certainly very few Americans would take the time to go through Eastern Europe, but I went down the whole route all the way from the Baltic states in the north down to Poland, East Germany, what was Czechoslovakia, now it's Czech Republic and Slovakia, down to Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and then Yugoslavia, which is now 7 different countries. And I was able to see them during that time. But again, we didn't know that this was all about to end within the next year or two. This is the way it had been for 40 years, and this is what we accepted. And I would go and try to talk with people, try to watch people, learn, see what I could. And one kind of cute example was I was in Bulgaria, and I came out of a bathroom, and I noticed a guy following me. And sure enough, he would follow me on the other side of the street no matter where I went. And I went into a store, and he was there waiting for me. And you don't know if that's the KGB of their country, their secret police. You don't know if it's a hustler trying to, trade dollars with you. You don't know if it's a guy trying to rob you. It's very scary, and, you're on your own. So I went into a park and hid behind a big boulder. And sure enough, 2 or 3 minutes later, he comes, and I jumped out at him. I scared him. And I confronted him. What are you doing? Why are you following me? And I swear this is the truth. He didn't speak English very well, and he said, "I not follow you. I look for Christmas trees." And I said, "Okay." And so we ended up walking back to my hotel. We never said a word to each other. I still don't know what he was up to, but that's the kind of bizarre things that would happen in these countries. In Romania, as an example, I had diarrhea, and I went into a pharmacy, which is all these babushka ladies, and I ended up having to pantomime diarrhea to get the right medication. And these are just the cute things that stay with you, and you do the best you can. As embarrassing as they are, you have to survive and figure things out for yourself.
Yeah, and the people around you must have thought you were crazy, friends, family. They're like, "What are you doing?" And that was kind of the norm. It was normal to think that other side of the world is crazy for how they're living, and for you to visit them is kind of out of the realm of possibility for a lot of people and their mindset. But you going there, and that guy in Bulgaria that followed you, he might not even have been official. He just wanted to gain some brownie points with an official person to try to gain status, right? And that's the way it was.
Yeah. You don't know who to trust, what to think of people. Everywhere I didn't mean to stand out, but I clearly did, just from my clothing and my manner, my backpack. I didn't mean to get attention drawn to me, but it's inevitable, especially in those days.
Of course, man. And they didn't have much English. English wasn't widespread throughout the region as well. So you had to figure out ways to pantomime or do these things to get the necessary items to live and to make yourself better. But being in Yugoslavia, you were essentially in a powder keg that eventually exploded later on. Talk about that. Did you feel the tension in there?
Again, when you don't have the language, sometimes you have to be more perceptive and watch people, look in their eyes. It can be kind of an advantage, and there is no question that I could see in certain group settings that the Serbs would stay together, the Croats would stay together, the Bosnian-Herzegovinians, they all had different religions, they had slightly different ways of dressing, they didn't trust each other, they didn't talk to each other, they could tell in a moment who was who and what was what. I didn't have any inkling that it would end up in a civil war, but I could definitely see the fear in each other's eyes if they were in an uncomfortable place that they weren't familiar with. There was definitely tension in that country, no question about it.
That's just amazing that you got to experience that type of travel. And being there with the unknowns. You didn't have social media and these things and the phone to just latch onto and be able to essentially be a crutch for you. You just had to go with the flow, and whatever happened. And you kind of knew in that time with newspapers and these things that they were stirring, and you could see it, and it was palpable for you. Being there in that time, you just had to fly by the seat of your pants.
Yeah, I learned a lot of tricks. One was that a smile goes a long way. Another was to learn a couple words, especially thank you in whatever language that was. They were impressed that a young American or Westerner would take the time to learn that much about their country. And generally, people are good. In general, people want to help you. But you also have to keep one eye open for the ones who are on their own and trying to do their up to no good. So I learned from travel to look people in the eyes, to get a feeling for their, for lack of a better word, aura, or their honesty, integrity. And through travel and not having the same game rules, when I meet American, I can tell in a second a lot about them. I don't have that when I meet foreigners, so I have to really give them a little bit more time and try to see if I can begin to trust them and see what they're up to.
Yeah, because you have to rely on more body language as opposed to them talking to you and the social cues that they give you through language. And then you had to use the body language and kind of decipher that, right?
100%, you're exactly right. And I remember some things are cute. As it happens in Bulgaria, they're the only country that nods their head up and down when they say no. So I was trying to get into a disco, and the doorman, I said, can I go in? And he nodded up and down, and I would start to go take a step in, and he'd push me back. And I said, can I go in? And he would nod up and down, but was saying the word no. And we had this dance for a few seconds until I finally learned that nodding up and down means no in Bulgarian.
And that's just the exact opposite. And it's just hard, to understand that they do it completely different there. And but you were in a totally different part of the world, man, and culturally, geographically. So that time, being there at that time in history really is fascinating, and not a lot of people can say that they've traveled through those countries.
Yeah, we had no idea that we were going to be in countries that weren't going to exist as they were in just a few years. I was just on the adventure. I was an explorer. If I'm being honest, I was chasing women, and I was just trying to see and do as much as I could. Nobody knows what the future holds, so I had a belief, and I still do as much as you can with your day as possible. I wrote my book, The Happy Wanderer, to recount these stories, but also to help young people to think about and examine the idea of travel on a lengthy period and see what's out there and see, most of all, what makes you tick. Learn about yourself.
Yeah, it's about learning about yourself as well. And you do discover a lot about yourself when you're put in uncomfortable situations and put in these different scenarios that kind of shape you as a traveler. It is sad at times, but it does give you perspective on how good we have it in this Western world. And being from the United States, you do have a lot of privilege and a lot of amenities and a lot of comfortabilities that a lot of people do not have even today.
Yeah. I shared with you some of the dangerous situations I was in, some of the embarrassing situations I was in. But what that does is equips you to deal with that type of situation for the rest of your days. You can't be embarrassed unless you allow yourself to be embarrassed, is something I learned. And, providing nothing serious happens to you, you can laugh about it, and you're equipped to deal with a similar situation for the rest of your days.
Yeah, and you were able to document all this in a great way. You did take a lot of portrait shots of people, and you kept those photographs, in which I think is incredible. A lot of people wouldn't have the foresight to take all these pictures, and that's one thing about your book that's so unique, is that it incorporates all these pictures you took from all of your travels. You made sure to make it a point to document that. One thing I do want to tell people is you should document it. Whether you want an old film camera or a digital camera, just document it and get it, get those memories. And a lot of people believe that that's not living in the moment, but that's not true. You can take time and document what you're going through, so that gives you a better frame of reference going in the future to look back on and remember these things more vividly, and you can live in the moment and take pictures as well.
100%. For me, because I can't read or write well, one way I learned to express myself is through photography. So I would try to take creative pictures, and first, when you're young, you take pictures of the places, but as I got more experienced, I wanted to take pictures of the people. And that's harder to do because if you hold up a camera to a person, they're going to turn around or they're going to pose. So eventually, I learned to set the focus and set the camera and put it on my hip and turn sideways to them and take the picture without them realizing I was taking the picture. And that was how I got the moments of culture that I call it in my book. So you get people in their real life, day to day, without, like I say, posing or, and you can capture a lot about a culture by looking at how the people live day by day.
Yeah, that's amazing, and that's a great tip. I didn't even know that. I've never done that. I take more of landscape, but it's good to take pictures in the moment and of people, because that's what makes a place, is the people. So you're traveling through the Eastern Bloc. One of the last countries you end up in is East Germany, which is very, very tight security. It's known to be one of the most surveilled nanny states in history. But you went there because you had a friend from law school that you met in the Soviet Union, a young lady. Talk about her and talk about the point leading up to going to Eastern Germany.
Yeah, I had met a young lady in my travels in the Soviet Union, beautiful blonde. We hit it off. It was cute in the Soviet Union. We were staying in the same hotel. She was from East Germany. And understand, East Germany was the most authoritarian police state you can possibly imagine. And so the only places they could go to visit were the Soviet Union, practically. And I met her, and every day I would meet her in the lobby, and I would speak my best German to her. She would speak her broken English to me, and the poor Russian KGB were listening microphones. And at one point, I saw a guy come up out of a nondescript door and try to see who was talking because he was so confused with all these different languages. And she and I hit it off, and we would write to each other. You have no way of knowing if your letters get through because they either throw them away or they edit them and so forth. And I would try to go visit her, and eventually I made arrangements to go visit her.
So you arrived in Eastern Germany, and at the time, it was an incredible. You're coming to the end of all of the communist states and the end of the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain. But arriving in Eastern Germany and meeting her, she did have a boyfriend at the time. So talk about him and the dynamic of how that might have been a little awkward coming back and seeing her.
Yeah, they had nothing. I expected her to have a boyfriend. She was a beautiful 25-year-old. And one of the cute things that I remember is for her birthday, he made for her a miniskirt. You have to understand, they had nothing. But she was a little bit too big hips for the amount of leather for the miniskirt. So he made leather lace straps to go up her sides so that the miniskirt would still work. And that's a little anecdote about how they did their best to make something work in very difficult circumstances. So in communism, for instance, when they wanted to build a house, they would get their friend the plumber to come over, their friend the carpenter to come over, and then when it was their turn to have some work done, you would go over and help them. They all had a common enemy, which was the system, and they just did the best they could to survive in a very trying situation. I have so much respect for people who came out of that existence and how they made it. It was very difficult times.
Yeah, essentially they were just in survival mode. They were at the mercy of the system and the police and the Stasi at the time,
Yeah,
right?
Right.
So in Eastern Germany at the time, they just had to make their clothes or anything. I mean, they're getting little bits and pieces of information from the outside world, from the Western world, and I can imagine how curious they were about that.
Yeah, I remember going to a party, and they were all in love with Frank Zappa music. And they asked me to translate it. I couldn't translate Zappa music to English. It's really weird lyrics, but I tried to explain as best I could, but they were protesting. It was illegal for them to wear blue jeans, so they would only wear them to the parties at night, and so the police wouldn't see them in blue jeans. And if you lived on the western part of East Germany, you could get West German television and radio. And so they were starting to see the things that they were missing out on, from a McDonald's cheeseburger to a Coca-Cola to other commercial products to quality of life. And that started movements going that, we want more out of our life. And these were the underlying forces that eventually led to the fall of communism.
Yeah, and it was a great time in history for them to be able to have more independence and more of a future, and that was something that they just wanted to have their own money and be able to start their own, just maybe their own business or anything like that, to gain a little capital to make it out of that environment and that oppression. I mean, it was just severe oppression every day.
Yeah, they wanted our dollars dearly. They would trade products that they had for our dollars. They wanted more, especially the young people. They weren't satisfied with communism or socialism, but they also had the police state to deal with. And it was this boiling, simmering unhappiness, unease, discontent that eventually boiled over. I didn't know it, but it was going to happen 18 months later.
So you happened to go to West Berlin at the time. And so you made it over there, and you wanted to go over there and come back with some items for your friends. Yeah. You were really wanting to help them and get them some items that they really wanted from the Western world.
Yeah, understand they had nothing. I mean, later on, I was able to see my Stasi report for that young lady, and the neighbors were reporting on her that she had a young Western man visiting her and went jogging every night. This is the type of control. So first we decided to go to a park while I was visiting with her in East Germany, and I didn't know that Germans are nudists. So we went to the park. I was 27 or so, and part of my anatomy hadn't seen the sun in 26 years, but everybody's there lying naked, and very interesting experience for me, underneath a banner that says, "We all love our communist fatherland." And so we decided to go up to Berlin. And now, if you remember, Germany was cut in half between communists and Western, and so too was Berlin. So I was going to cross over into West Berlin, a free place, and they were going to stay in East Berlin. And as I was about to depart from them, and I was planning to come back the next day, the young couple now asked me to buy them something special. And I love these people, and I'm like, I hope it's not drugs or something that's going to get me in a lot of trouble. But I love them. I said, what do you need? And they said, can you buy us vibrator, a vibrator? And I said, okay. So I went into West Berlin. The next morning I woke up early. I bought them fresh meat and fresh fruit, and I bought him Playboy and her Elle magazine. And at 10:30 in the morning, I walked into one of the sex shops in West Berlin, and in my broken German, I said, "Excuse me, have you a vibrator?" And the big fat man with half a T-shirt down his belly said, "You want a vibrator?" And everybody was looking at me, and my face was beet red, and I didn't know what to say. And he said, come. And he's got, I'm not exaggerating, 350 different types of vibrators on the wall. And he was really proud. And he was like, this one plays music, this one glows in the dark, and this one is this, and this is this. And I had never bought a vibrator before. And I said, well, what's a normal everyday vibrator? And he goes, well, what do you want to use it for? And I was lost for words. So I bought a vibrator, and I stuck it in the sleeve of my jacket, and I went over to the border control back into East Berlin.
So you go back over with a vibrator in your sleeve and some Burger King. And by this time, the Burger King's cold. You got a burger for her boyfriend to try, and obviously her to try as well. And so you get up there, and how embarrassing was it? And how was it how much anxiety did you have?
It's a little bit hard to explain, but when we meet other people, there's an interaction. We nod, we smile. There's certain human interactions that are universal. But with the border control guards in East Germany, there was none of that. It was like looking at a wall or a robot. There was no human interaction. So they look in my passport and they would say, you were in the DDR, which is Deutsches Democratic Republic, the official name for East Germany. Yesterday, why do you come back? I said, to be a tourist. Who do you know here? I don't know anybody. Why do you come here? To be a tourist. Who do you know here? And this went on, and then they do the backpack, and they see all my food and magazines, and they say, come, 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 and they take me into a back room, and they do the pat down. Now, you try to explain why there's a vibrator in your sleeve if you're traveling on your own into East Europe. And they were not happy. And every hour they'd come in, who do you know here? Who is this for? What is this for? They went through all my books, trying to find an address, and I knew that, so I had memorized where to meet them. It was a very, very intimidating situation. I don't care how tough you think you are. These guys have guns, they're big, they're intimidating, they look right down at you, and it was a really, really frightening moment in my life. And eventually, I saw them lock the door, and they left me there overnight in this holding cell. And I was pounding on the door. Nobody came. No food, no water, nothing at all. And I luckily had one candy bar and the fresh fruit that I had for the others and half of their cheeseburger. And I ate that. And I just kind of hung out there. And the next morning, about 5 a.m, some guy comes on. He looked like a South American general. He had a lot more medals on him. And he goes, who do you know in DDR? And I said, I'm not talking to you. I want to see somebody from the American Embassy. Yes, yes. Who do you know in the DDR? And they were trying to get it out of me. Eventually, I just shut up. And about the third or fourth guy, he said passport. I handed it to him. He stamped visa in it. And I was allowed into East Germany a day late. And I went to what's called Alexanderplatz, which is our meeting place. Very famous square in the middle of Berlin. Very famous historically. And they were my friends, and they were like, Michael, Michael. And I was amazed that they were there a day later. But they had known about some of the problems that happens in East Germany. And I was afraid that the KGB would follow me because I was allowed in with my vibrator and my fruit and everything else. So I said, come, come, come. And we got on it's called a U-Bahn, which is an overhead subway. And we went down one stop. And everybody got off the train, and people got on the train. And the last minute, I grabbed my friends, and we jumped off the train. And I looked around to see if anybody else got off late. And that would mean we were being followed. I think that was pretty clever. That was as close to James Bond as I'm going to get. And nobody jumped off the train, and I was able to go to their place and give them all their supplies.
And meeting back up with them, I know they were shocked that you even made it back in. And then just having the items with you and them knowing that you didn't get that confiscated. Mm-hmm. And how happy were they? I had
one of my pictures is them trying their first cheeseburger, their first Coca-Cola. Can you imagine seeing that on TV and knowing it existed, being in your 20s and not being able to even taste it or know what it was like? And so, I brought a little bit of hope, I think, into their life. A little bit of freedom. I like to think that they didn't stay together, but I'm friends with both of them to this day, and I did my little part to make their day a little bit brighter.
And that's an incredible experience to be able to share with somebody at that time some Western conveniences. With that, we're probably going to wrap up soon and in part 1. But thank you for joining me on this, and we will talk about the rest of the book on part 2. Make sure you tune in for that. And Michael, it's been an awesome time talking to you on this segment. And thank you for coming on and sharing your experiences, because a lot of people cannot say they've done half of the things you've done.
Thank you. It's been a wonderful experience, and thank you for letting me share some of my stories.
All right. So next time we'll have part 2 of The Happy Wonder, Dyslexic's Global Adventure, and we will go from there. And thank you for listening. And folks, always remember, the world is your oyster.
That's a wrap on this episode of People, Places, and Things. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Whether you're dreaming of your next adventure or just love hearing stories from across the globe, we hope we inspired a bit of wanderlust in you today. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave us a review, and share it with fellow travelers. Until next time, keep exploring, keep dreaming, keep discovering new people, places, and things.